The 17th of January 1945, Holtzwihr, Alsace, northeastern France. The snow had been falling for 3 days without mercy. It covered the burned-out farmhouses, the shattered trees, the frozen bodies still waiting for burial. The temperature had dropped to -12 degrees Celsius. Every breath formed clouds of vapor that hung in the air like tiny ghosts. The landscape was white and silent, save for the distant rumble of artillery and the occasional crack of a sniper's rifle. In the frosted fields between the Ill River and the Fecht River, the ground was hard as iron, and the cold turned sweat into ice within minutes. A single man crouched in a shallow foxhole near the edge of a tree line. His uniform was dusted with snow. His hands, wrapped in fingerless gloves, gripped the stock of an M1 carbine. His name was Audie Murphy. He was 20 years old. He weighed 65 kilograms. He stood 165 centimeters tall. By the standards of the United States Army, he was undersized, almost fragile in appearance. His face was boyish, his frame slight. He looked like someone who should have been studying in a high school somewhere in Texas, not commanding a rifle company in the frozen killing fields of eastern France. But appearances, as the Germans were about to learn, meant nothing. The day before, Murphy's Company B had been ordered to hold a position near the village of Holtzwihr. The Germans were advancing with a force estimated at 6 companies, supported by at least 6 panzer tanks. The Allied advance through Alsace had stalled. The winter offensive had turned into a grinding war of attrition. Every metre of ground cost lives. Every village was a fortress. The Germans, retreating toward the Rhine, fought with the desperation of men defending their homeland. They were no longer the invincible Wehrmacht of 1,940. They were exhausted, outnumbered, outgunned. But they were still dangerous. Murphy's company had been reduced to 19 men. 18 of his soldiers were wounded or dead. He had already sent them back. He stayed. That was the kind of man Audie Murphy was. The irony was profound. In another time, in another war, Audie Murphy would never have been a soldier. He had been rejected by the Navy for being too short. He had been rejected by the Marines for being too light. The Army had only accepted him reluctantly, and even then, some of his instructors thought he wouldn't survive basic training. He had grown up in rural Texas, the son of sharecroppers, in a house without electricity or running water. His father abandoned the family. His mother died when he was 16. He picked cotton to feed his younger siblings. He hunted rabbits and squirrels with a borrowed rifle to keep them from starving. When he enlisted in 1942, he weighed 54 kilograms. He was malnourished, undereducated, and utterly determined. The recruiting officer looked at him and saw a boy. Murphy looked back and saw his only way out of poverty. He lied about his age. He lied about his health. He would have lied about anything to get into the fight. He didn't join the army because he hated the Germans. He joined because he was hungry. Because his family was hungry. Because the military offered 3 meals a day and a paycheck he could send home. The ideology came later. The hatred came later. The transformation from a cotton-picking farm boy into one of the most lethal soldiers in American military history came slowly, battle by battle, death by death, until the boy from Texas had killed so many men he stopped counting. By January 1945, Audie Murphy had been in combat for 2.5 years. He had fought in North Africa, Sicily, Anzio, southern France. He had been wounded 3 times. He had contracted malaria. He had watched his best friend die in his arms. He had killed dozens of enemy soldiers, maybe more than 100, though he never kept precise records. He had become numb to death, numb to fear, numb to everything except the mechanical process of survival. His letters home were brief and distant. He no longer spoke about the war in personal terms. He had learned to shut off the part of himself that felt. But on the morning of January 17, something inside him flickered back to life. It wasn't hope. It wasn't courage. It was something darker and more primal. Rage. The German attack began at dawn. 6 panzers rolled forward through the snow, engines roaring, treads clanking against the frozen earth. Behind them came waves of infantry, grey uniformed shadows moving through the mist. They advanced in textbook formation, fire and manoeuvre, one squad covering while another moved forward. These were not the poorly trained Volkssturm conscripts. These were veterans, likely remnants of a Panzer Grenadier division pulled from the Eastern Front. They knew how to fight. Murphy watched them come. His company's position was indefensible. They had no anti-tank weapons heavy enough to stop a panzer. They had no artillery support. The nearest American unit was 3 kilometers away. He radioed for help, but the response was bleak. No reinforcements available, hold as long as possible, withdraw if necessary. Murphy had no intention of withdrawing. He ordered his men back to a secondary position in the woods. Most of them were already wounded. Some could barely walk. He told them to set up a base of fire and cover his retreat. Then he grabbed a field telephone, the wire still connected to the company's forward observer, and ran toward an abandoned M10 tank destroyer sitting in the middle of the field. The M10 had been hit the day before. It was immobilized, one of its tracks blown off, but the .50 caliber machine gun mounted on top was still operational. Murphy climbed onto the vehicle, crouched behind the gun, and plugged in the telephone line. He could call in artillery strikes from this position. He could direct fire onto the advancing Germans. He could, perhaps, slow them down long enough for his men to escape. What he didn't expect was that the Germans would focus everything on him. There is a moment in every battle when calculation gives way to instinct, when training and discipline dissolve into something more ancient. Soldiers call it different things. Some call it the red mist. Some call it going automatic. Some say it's when you stop being afraid because you've already accepted that you're dead. Audie Murphy climbed onto that burning tank destroyer and became something other than human. The Germans saw him immediately. A single American soldier, standing on top of a disabled vehicle, exposed to fire from every direction. They must have thought he was insane, or suicidal, or both. They redirected their advance toward him. Infantry squads broke off and began maneuvering closer. Panzers swiveled their turrets. Machine guns opened up, stitching lines of bullets through the snow around the M10. Murphy didn't flinch. He opened fire with the .50 caliber. The sound was deafening, a deep, hammering rhythm that echoed across the frozen field. The first burst cut down 3 Germans advancing through the snow. The second burst shredded a machine gun crew setting up near a farmhouse. The third burst punched through the vision slits of a panzer, forcing it to halt and reposition. Then he grabbed the field telephone and started calling in artillery strikes. His voice was calm, measured, precise. He gave coordinates. He adjusted fire. He walked the shells closer and closer to his own position, so close that shrapnel whistled past his head. The German infantry, caught in the open, began to disintegrate. Bodies tumbled into the snow. Men screamed. Officers shouted contradictory orders. The advance slowed, then stopped. But they didn't retreat. They kept coming. The Germans could not understand what they were seeing. In their military doctrine, a single soldier in an exposed position was a target, not a threat. Suppressing fire should have driven him to cover. A direct hit from a tank shell should have vaporized him, but Murphy kept firing. The .50 caliber roared without pause. Every burst found flesh, every burst killed. One German squad tried to flank him from the left. Murphy swung the machine gun and cut them down before they covered 20 meters. Another squad crawled through a drainage ditch, trying to get close enough for a grenade. Murphy spotted them, adjusted the gun's angle, and raked the ditch with fire. The bodies piled up in the frozen water. A panzer tried to advance within range. Murphy called in an artillery strike that landed 5 meters in front of the tank, blowing off its track and immobilizing it. The crew bailed out. Murphy killed 3 of them before they reached cover. The 4th crawled into a shell crater and stayed there, trembling, until nightfall. 45 seconds. That's how long the most intense phase of the engagement lasted, 45 seconds, during which Audie Murphy killed 21 German soldiers. Some historians dispute the exact number. Some say it was higher. Some say it was lower. But the after-action reports, the witness statements, the body count verified by American patrols later that day, all confirm that Murphy, alone, firing a single machine gun from an exposed position, killed at least 24 enemy soldiers in less than a minute. And then he laughed. The laughter was not joyous. It was not celebratory. Witnesses who saw Murphy that day described it as something hollow and mechanical, the sound a man makes when he's crossed a line he can never uncross. He laughed because the absurdity of the situation had broken something inside him. He laughed because he was still alive and couldn't understand why. He laughed because the Germans kept coming, kept dying, kept feeding themselves into the machine gun's arc of fire like moths into a flame. The M10 tank destroyer was burning beneath him. The Germans had hit it with incendiary rounds, and the fuel tank had ignited. Smoke poured from the engine compartment. The metal hull was heating up, hot enough to blister skin. Murphy's boots were smoking. His uniform was singed. But he stayed on the gun. He kept firing. He called in more artillery. He directed the strikes with the precision of a surgeon, dropping shells onto German positions with ruthless efficiency. By the time the Germans finally broke and retreated, Murphy had been standing on that burning vehicle for nearly an hour. His hands were blistered from the heat of the machine gun. His ears were ringing from the noise. His body was shaking from adrenaline and cold. When he finally climbed down, his legs gave out, and he collapsed in the snow. His men found him there, lying on his back, staring at the sky, still gripping the telephone receiver. He looked up at them and said, "Did we hold?" They told him yes. The Germans had withdrawn. The position was secure. Murphy nodded, closed his eyes, and passed out. The story of what happened at Holzver spread through the American lines like wildfire. Officers who read the after-action report thought it was exaggerated. Some suspected Murphy had invented details to cover for a tactical error. But the witnesses corroborated everything. The medics who treated him confirmed his injuries. The forward observers who had been on the other end of the telephone confirmed the artillery strikes. The graves registration teams counted the bodies. 21 confirmed kills, possibly more, from a single position, in less than an hour, against 6 companies of German infantry and 6 tanks. It was statistically impossible. It defied logic. It defied probability. But it had happened. The United States Army awarded Audie Murphy the Medal of Honor. The citation read, in part, "Second Lieutenant Murphy commanded Company B, which was attacked by 6 tanks and waves of infantry. He ordered his men to withdraw, while he remained forward at his command post and continued to give fire directions to the artillery. The enemy tanks, losing infantry support, began to fall back. For an hour, the Germans tried every available weapon to eliminate Murphy, but he continued to hold his position and wiped out a squad which was trying to creep up unnoticed on his right flank. Germans reached as close as 10 yards, only to be mowed down by his fire. He received a leg wound, but ignored it, and continued the single-handed fight until his ammunition was exhausted. He then made his way to his company, refused medical attention, and organized the company in a counterattack which forced the Germans to withdraw. The dry, bureaucratic language of the citation could not capture what had actually happened. It could not convey the heat of the burning tank, the screams of dying men, the mechanical precision with which Murphy had executed his defense. It could not explain why a 20-year-old farm boy from Texas had chosen to stand and fight when every instinct, every rational thought, should have told him to run. But the Germans understood. Among the prisoners captured after the battle, several were interviewed by American intelligence officers. Their accounts were fragmentary, confused, traumatized. But a pattern emerged. The German soldiers spoke of Murphy with a mixture of fear and respect. They called him Der kleine Teufel, the little devil. They said he moved like a machine. They said he didn't miss. They said he fought like a man who had nothing to lose. One captured German sergeant, a veteran of the Eastern Front who had survived Stalingrad, told his interrogators that he had never seen anything like Murphy's stand. "We thought he was already dead," the sergeant said. "We saw the tank burning. We saw him standing there, and we thought he was a ghost. But ghosts don't kill. This man killed. He killed and killed and killed, and nothing stopped him. Not fear, not fire, not bullets. We had 6 companies. We had tanks. We should have crushed him in 5 minutes. But he didn't break. He made us break." The sergeant paused, then added, "In Russia, we fought men who were defending their homeland. They fought hard because they had no choice. But this American, he wasn't defending his home. He was thousands of kilometers from his home. He chose to stand. That is what terrified us. He chose it." That choice, that deliberate acceptance of almost certain death, was incomprehensible to the German soldiers. They had been raised in a military culture that emphasized discipline, obedience, and collective action. The idea that a single individual could turn the tide of a battle through sheer willpower was foreign to them. It violated their understanding of how war worked. But it was quintessentially American. The transformation of Audie Murphy from a malnourished farm boy into the most decorated American soldier of World War II was not the result of superior training or better equipment. It was the result of a uniquely American ideology, the belief that individual action matters, that one person can make a difference, that freedom is worth dying for, even when that freedom is not your own. Murphy had grown up in poverty. He had experienced hunger, deprivation, the casual cruelty of an economic system that ground down the poor and discarded them. He had every reason to be cynical, to view the war as just another form of exploitation. But instead, he internalized the promise of American democracy, that courage and determination could elevate anyone, that sacrifice had meaning, that heroism was not the exclusive domain of the well-born or the well-fed. The Germans, by contrast, had been raised in a system that promised order, strength, and national glory. They had been told that their suffering was necessary, that their sacrifices served a higher purpose. But by 1945, those promises had been revealed as lies. The Third Reich was collapsing. The cities were in ruins. The dream of a 1,000-year empire had become a nightmare of ash and blood. The German soldiers at Holzweier were fighting for nothing except the faint hope of survival. Murphy was fighting for something more, not for territory, not for glory, but for the idea that freedom, real freedom, the kind that let a sharecropper's son become a hero, was worth defending. That idea gave him strength the Germans could not match. There was an object that recurred in Murphy's life, a symbol of American abundance that marked his journey from poverty to war hero: food. As a child, Murphy had been perpetually hungry. His family survived on cornmeal, beans, and whatever game he could shoot. He once told an interviewer that the defining memory of his childhood was the feeling of going to bed with an empty stomach, night after night, year after year. Hunger shaped him. It made him relentless. It taught him that survival required taking action, that waiting for help meant starving. When he joined the army, one of the first things that astonished him was the food. 3 meals a day: meat, bread, vegetables, dessert. He wrote to his sister that he couldn't believe how much food the army gave him. He gained 10 kilograms in the first 6 months of training. He had never been so well fed in his life. The German soldiers by 1945 were starving. Their supply lines were collapsing. Rations were cut to a few hundred calories a day. Many subsisted on thin soup and stale bread. They scavenged food from the dead. They traded cigarettes for scraps. Hunger weakened them, demoralized them, made them desperate. After the battle at Holzweier, American medics treating wounded German prisoners noted their emaciated condition. One medic wrote in his diary, "These men look like skeletons. They're half-starved." One of them cried when we gave him a chocolate bar. Just cried and cried. The contrast was stark. The Americans, even in the middle of a brutal winter campaign, had access to supplies the Germans could only dream of. sea rations, coffee, chocolate, cigarettes. The logistical machinery of the American war effort ensured that soldiers like Murphy were fed, equipped, and supported. The German war machine, by contrast, was grinding itself to dust. Food became a symbol of the ideological divide. On one side, a nation that could afford to feed its soldiers, that valued individual lives enough to supply them with abundance. On the other, a regime that consumed its own people, that demanded sacrifice without offering sustenance, that reduced men to walking corpses in service of a dying dream. Murphy, who had known hunger, understood this better than most. He had lived on both sides of that divide. He had been the starving child, and he had become the well-fed soldier. That transformation was not incidental. It was the essence of what he was fighting for. The possibility of abundance, the promise that suffering could end, that the future could be different from the past. The German soldiers who faced Murphy at Holzfeuer expected to encounter fear. They expected hesitation. They expected the Americans to retreat, as rational soldiers should, when confronted with overwhelming force. What they got instead was a 20-year-old man who stood on a burning tank and refused to die. That refusal was incomprehensible to them. It violated the logic of war, but it was the logic of American democracy made flesh, the individual standing against the collective, the small against the large, the free man against the totalitarian machine. Murphy later said that he didn't remember most of what happened during the battle. He said it felt like watching someone else's actions from a distance. Psychologists would later recognize this as a dissociative state, a mental defense mechanism triggered by extreme stress. But in the moment, that dissociation allowed him to function with ruthless efficiency. He became a machine himself, as relentless and impersonal as the .50 caliber he was firing. But even machines require fuel. And Murphy's fuel was not ideology or training or discipline. It was rage. Rage at the Germans for killing his friends. Rage at the war for stealing his youth. Rage at a universe that had given him nothing and demanded everything. That rage sustained him when logic failed, when his body was breaking down, when every rational thought told him to run. And when it was over, when the Germans had retreated and the field was silent except for the moaning of the wounded, Murphy climbed down from the burning tank and collapsed. The rage drained out of him, leaving only exhaustion and a profound, aching emptiness. He was 20 years old. He had killed more men than he could count, and he would spend the rest of his life trying to forget. The aftermath of the battle at Holzfeuer revealed the human cost of Murphy's stand. 21 Germans dead in the immediate vicinity of the M10, another 30 wounded. The panzer crews had abandoned their vehicles and retreated on foot. The German attack had been shattered. Company B, reduced to a handful of men, had held its position. The line had not broken. But Murphy had broken. Not visibly, not immediately, but something inside him had fractured. The dissociative state that had allowed him to function during the battle never fully receded. He began to experience flashbacks, nightmares, panic attacks. He couldn't sleep without a loaded pistol under his pillow. He couldn't walk into a crowded room without mapping out the exits. He flinched at loud noises. He woke up screaming. In later years, after the war, Murphy would become a movie star. He would play heroic soldiers in Hollywood films, including himself in the biopic To Hell and Back. But the real Audie Murphy, the one who survived Holzfeuer, was a haunted man. He self-medicated with pills and alcohol. He suffered from what would now be diagnosed as severe post-traumatic stress disorder. He slept with a gun for the rest of his life. He once told a reporter, "I'm glad I was able to do what I did, but I wish I didn't have to." When asked if he was proud of his Medal of Honor, he said, "I'm proud of the men I served with. I'm not proud of the killing." That ambivalence, that recognition of the cost of heroism, was perhaps the most profound lesson of Murphy's war. He had been transformed from a boy into a weapon, from a human being into a killing machine. That transformation had saved lives. It had won battles. but it had also destroyed the person he might have become. The Germans at Holzwihr learned a lesson that reverberated through the final months of the war. They learned that American soldiers, even the small ones, even the ones who looked like children, were capable of extraordinary violence. They learned that the United States, with its bottomless reserves of men and material, with its ideology of individual freedom and collective abundance, could produce soldiers who fought with a ferocity that ideology alone could not match. The German sergeant who had called Murphy der kleine Teufel was right. Murphy had become something demonic, something beyond human. But that transformation was not supernatural. It was the product of a nation that took starving farm boys and fed them, trained them, equipped them, and sent them to war with the promise that their sacrifices had meaning. The Germans had no equivalent promise. They fought for a regime that had lied to them, exploited them, and was now abandoning them. They fought because they had no choice, because desertion meant execution, because the alternative to fighting was surrender and the unknown horrors of Soviet or American captivity. Murphy fought because he chose to. That choice, repeated by thousands of American soldiers across Europe and the Pacific, was the difference between victory and defeat. In the decades after the war, military historians analyzed the battle at Holzwihr from every angle. They studied the terrain, the weather, the tactical decisions. They debated the exact number of Germans killed. They tried to understand how one man, armed with a single machine gun, had held off an entire battalion. The answer was both simple and complex. Murphy had superior firepower. He had artillery support. He had the advantage of a defensive position. But so did countless other soldiers who died when their positions were overrun. What set Murphy apart was not his equipment or his training. It was his refusal to accept defeat. That refusal was rooted in his personal history. He had survived poverty by refusing to give up. He had survived basic training by refusing to quit. He had survived 2.5 years of combat by refusing to break. At Holzwihr, he simply refused one more time. And that refusal, amplified by firepower and luck, became legend. But legends obscure as much as they reveal. The legend of Audie Murphy, the heroic soldier who single-handedly defeated the Germans, erases the reality of Audie Murphy, the traumatized young man who could never escape the war. It turns suffering into glory, trauma into triumph. It makes war seem noble, when in truth it is brutal and senseless and destroys everyone it touches. Murphy knew this. In his autobiography, he wrote, "I saw my friends killed. I killed men, and I watched the war destroy everyone who survived it. There are no heroes in war, only survivors. And sometimes, the survivors are the ones who suffer most." The snow at Holzwihr melted in the spring. The bodies were buried. The burned-out tank destroyer was hauled away for scrap. The field where Audie Murphy had made his stand became farmland again. Within a year, there was no visible evidence that a battle had ever taken place there. But the memory persisted. The soldiers who had fought beside Murphy told their children and grandchildren. The German survivors told their stories. The official histories recorded the facts. And Murphy himself, reluctant and conflicted, became a living symbol of American heroism. He died in a plane crash in 1971 at the age of 45. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His grave became one of the most visited sites in the cemetery, second only to John F. Kennedy's. Visitors leave flowers, coins, notes of thanks. Some leave cans of food, a tribute to the hungry boy from Texas who became the most decorated soldier of his generation. The irony is that Murphy would have hated the attention. He spent his post-war life trying to be ordinary, trying to escape the legend, trying to find peace. He never found it. The war had marked him too deeply. The ghosts of Holzwihr followed him to the end. There is a larger truth in Murphy's story, one that extends beyond the individual to the nature of democracy itself. Totalitarian systems are efficient. They mobilize resources, crush dissent, create uniformity, but they are brittle. When pressure is applied, they shatter. Democracy is messy, chaotic, inefficient. It allows for dissent, for individuality, for disorder. But it is resilient. It bends without breaking. It produces individuals like Audie Murphy, who can stand alone and refuse to fall. The Germans at Holzwihr were products of a system that valued the collective over the individual. They were well-trained, disciplined, obedient. But when the system failed them, when the supplies ran out and the orders stopped making sense, they broke. They had no reserves of individual will to draw upon. They had been taught to follow, not to lead, to obey, not to choose. Murphy was the product of a different system, one that had failed him in many ways, that had left him hungry and poor and desperate, but it had also given him freedom, the freedom to enlist, the freedom to fight, the freedom to choose to stand on a burning tank and refuse to die. That freedom, with all its costs and contradictions, was the ultimate weapon. The .50 caliber machine gun that Murphy used at Holzwihr is now in a museum. Visitors can see it, touch it, read the plaque that describes the battle. But they cannot understand what it felt like to fire it, to feel the recoil hammering against your body, to watch the bullets cut through flesh, to stand in the smoke and noise and chaos and refuse to break. That understanding died with the men who fought. Murphy tried to explain it in interviews, in his autobiography, in quiet conversations with fellow veterans. But words could not convey the reality. The transformation from human to weapon, from individual to machine, from boy to killer, was something that had to be experienced, and those who experienced it were forever changed. Murphy's laugh, that hollow mechanical sound witnessed by his comrades, was the sound of a man who had crossed the boundary between life and death and found himself still alive on the other side. It was not joy. It was recognition. Recognition that he had become something he never wanted to be, that the war had taken the hungry boy from Texas and turned him into a killer so efficient, so relentless, that even he was afraid of what he had become. Epilogue. On a cold January day in 1945, in a snow-covered field in northeastern France, a 20-year-old American soldier climbed onto a burning tank destroyer and refused to die. He killed 21 men in 45 seconds. He held off 6 companies of German infantry. He called in artillery strikes on his own position. He laughed while he did it. The Germans called him a devil. The Americans called him a hero. He called himself a survivor. The truth was more complicated. Audie Murphy was all of these things, and none of them. He was a product of American democracy, with all its promises and failures. He was living proof that freedom, real freedom, could transform a starving farm boy into the most effective killer on the battlefield. But he was also proof of the cost of that transformation, the psychological wounds that never healed, the ghosts that never left. The snow has long since melted at Holzwihr. The field is green again. Cows graze where men once died. But the lesson remains. Democracy does not produce perfect soldiers. It produces individuals who can choose to stand when logic tells them to run, who can laugh in the face of death, who can kill with ruthless efficiency, and then spend the rest of their lives haunted by what they've done. Audie Murphy stood on that burning tank because he chose to, not because he was ordered, not because he was afraid of punishment, but because he decided, in that moment, that his life was worth trading for his men's lives, that his death might have meaning, that the line had to hold. The line held. Murphy lived. 21 Germans died. And the boy from Texas, who had joined the army because he was hungry, became a symbol of something larger than himself. The idea that individual courage, multiplied across millions of ordinary people, could defeat totalitarianism. That abundance, both material and spiritual, was stronger than discipline. That freedom, messy and chaotic and inefficient, was ultimately more powerful than the machinery of oppression. That was the truth the Germans learned at Holzwihr. That was the truth that cost them the war. And that was the truth that Audie Murphy, haunted and hollow and forever changed, carried with him to his grave. The laughter echoed across the frozen field and faded into silence. But the memory remained, a testament to what one man could do when he refused to break, when he stood alone against the darkness and chose to fight. Not because he was superhuman, but because he was deeply, tragically, heroically human. And in that humanity, with all its contradictions and costs, lay the secret strength of American democracy, the belief that one person, even the smallest and poorest and most unlikely, could change the course of history, could stand on a burning tank and refuse to die, could laugh in the face of death and kill 21 men in 45 seconds, could choose freedom even when that choice meant becoming a weapon, even when that choice meant losing himself, even when that choice meant carrying the ghosts of Holtzvir for the rest of his life. Audie Murphy made that choice, and in making it, he won the battle, earned the Medal of Honor, and lost the war for his own soul. That is the paradox of heroism. That is the cost of freedom. That is the truth that history, with all its medals and monuments and museums, can never fully capture. The snow fell, the bullets flew, the machine gun roared, and a 20-year-old boy from Texas stood alone against an army and refused to fall. That is how wars are won, and that is how heroes are broken.